Testing. Receiving your content. Get ready. All right. Okay, so HYTHLODAY. Okay, first of all, it seems like, this issue has to do really with this extensional analysis and the way I approach things, and you're making demands like, oh, there's a problem. You have to have a specific intentional definition for life. So we'll get to that. But you start off your video, it's pretty much at the time talking about how you don't see that I'm going anywhere and whatnot. And this kind of vague stuff. It's like my video was a reply to your video. Everything in my notes was from something you said in your video. It's just kind of pointless. From my point of view, yeah, you have trouble seeing where I'm going with what I'm saying, even though it seems pretty clear to me the sequence that I'm presenting, my analysis of these abstractions we're discussing. And I think, it's, yeah, see, because one, you're stubborn, and from my point of view, you spent this time at the beginning of the video talking about what you think my interaction, just kind of the feel of it or something. I think you ask and forget that when I answered things. So you've asked me about if this dichotomy is sharp. I did answer. I described my thinking, and you forget points you made, like, hey, we each have, there's pyrrho definition of what it means to exist, and there's HYTHLODAYs. Now, once we have those two definitions, it's like, well, let's see what yours analyzes, right? Yours starts from these two categories, and you admit there's maybe a link between the categories, but that can be ignored, and it has a sharp tautological distinction anyway, and things that you believe. I can imagine that system, because although it has many imperfections, I think all systems have imperfections, so it doesn't mean it can't operate or be understood. I mean, an engine in a car, you can figure out how it works, whether you like a different style of engine or not, right? And then we would take my definition and see how it analyzed, and we compare, because this is a part of extensional analysis, right? When we have two definitions of something like life, we would then take that definition, go out into the world, look at things that it would say was alive. You say my definition makes dominoes alive. I think that's pretty clearly not the case, but there are issues, like, well, is a virus alive? And we go out, and this is done to test the definitions, right? The definitions aren't to just be believed by faith, and then as long as you're consistent to them, everything works out great. No, they're either apt or not. They either apply when applied back to the world, or they don't. Okay, so these semantic distinctions, you point out that, hey, we can each have and understand things this way, but then in this video you've gone a lot about how, we're going to have to, what did you say, agreement on what exists, but there's somewhere in here I saw. Well, maybe it'll come up in here. Maybe it was this one on the definition of somewhere you said. Oh, yeah, we'll have to have firm agreement about some of these things. How does that go with what you said about just figuring out? See, in my system of not convincing each other, this is the point. It's like, let's find out your definition of existence and follow it through, and we'll use mine and follow it through, and we'll compare them, and we'll have other people's definitions, and we'll invent definitions purely for, purpose of the question, thought experiments. And that's possible, but when you have this thing of convincing you, it seems like you forget we're talking, we're not trying to establish our firm agreement. We already know we have firm disagreements, and we're trying to find out what they are at this point. We could worry about changing them into agreements, once we knew what they were. If you're going to compare two things, you have to know what they are, right? So now I've spent 5 minutes talking about the styling and stuff. I mean, is that okay? I think it's just kind of weak. You should just focus on the topics. If I go on a tangent, you don't have to answer on that tangent. I'm not, if I'm specifically saying here, this particular thing's important to answer, I'll try to say that, Other than that, you're welcome to look at it and then choose some of the subjects. Our agreement on what exists is that you agree my definition is a thing that we both know what it is, and I agree your definition is a thing that we both know what it is. I'm not going to agree that there is a strong dichotomy between abstractions and things that have a physical location. You can work this through yourself in that the idea of a physical location is an abstraction we take from the stream. If some of the things we feel don't seem to have a specific location, they're still in the stream. They still exist, right? Now, are those abstractions? Well, I would say, yeah. What about the color blue? Does it exist? Is there an blue is already an abstraction. Our brain automatically paints this color in our head, in our visual space, when, the photon is just of a certain wavelength. And you could be colorblind. You could be a different animal that doesn't see that color or sees the colors differently. So as far as I'm concerned, this is already information, meaning it's already an abstraction of something else. This isn't direct information about the world. We've seen that it's indirect. It's through the eyes and the senses, and then through all kinds of cortical materials, a bunch of brain, before whatever it is that's having this film strip gets it. It's already been processed a lot into things like 3D. We have a 2D camera and a 2D camera. It's already 3D by the time we get it. So no, I don't see the clear distinction. We're not going to agree on that. I do understand the idea that you're making that distinction, and it's clean enough. In other words, you can ignore the spatial location of the law of cause and effect. You can ignore that and talk about the law of cause. But of course, when you apply it, and it comes from, and the whole idea of a cause and effect includes time, right? Because cause and effect goes over time. And I would say it also includes space, but you get to ignore it. Why? Because you're not saying anything about space. Because cause and effect applies in all these situations where things are 20 feet apart or 10 feet apart, or they're hot, they're cold, they're gas, they're liquid. All these different physical things you're ignoring by just saying cause and effect. But really, the cause and effect is all about this situation in which there is space and time, and all abstractions would be like that. So the concept itself has the basic data available, right, about time and space involved with it. I think most math does. And furthermore, of course, it does have a place. It's in the brain, right, just in the same sense that the software I'm streaming this with is in my computer. I don't know. On the other hand, if you want to agree by whatever you were talking about, saying my definition subsumes yours, like it would include yours, yeah, that's part of the point. Is that we're trying to start at a starting point, and we've all assumed as a society, it seems like, that the starting point is these simple axioms that we could. But no, the starting point is the data, and we get axioms from the data. I don't see any other way that it can happen. But I can imagine your system where you think of everything as in place, in a space, and therefore physical in that sense, or that it's an abstraction. Okay? I've told you why I don't think that distinction is necessary. To me, the distinction of abstraction is just that you got colors, they're already abstract. But then you compare colors and things. You could compare, hey, this patch of colors, it looks like a bird, and this patch of colors looks like a fish. And the idea of fish and bird are abstractions, but they're pretty tangible, right? Because they are fish and birds. And then animals. And then you get higher and higher levels, but it's really deeper and deeper into reducing the data and getting generalities. And so the abstraction is just on a line of, more and more meta, more and more abstract, is just getting, further and further away from this based on, I've reduced and I got a set of things like color, sound, space, time, will. And then I start looking for patterns in those concepts, and I get these deeper and deeper concepts that we happen for fun also to call higher and higher level concepts. But whatever, they're more abstract. They're the data reduction, right? It's like if you had a bunch of data from a sensor and you run it through a computer, we call that data reduction. You get out the average. What's the average value of all of these pixels? And that would be a data reduction. You got this one number. It's not that it isn't related. Of course, it's still related. You get all of these averages and you start doing mathematical analysis on them, and you get more and more deeper, like integrating over a function. You get this deeper and deeper. What's the change of the curve? What's the change of the curve? What's the it's the same exact thing. That's actually a great example just out of space. Is you got distance, and then its velocity is the change in distance, and acceleration is the change in velocity, and jerk is the change in acceleration, and so on and so forth. We stop having special names for them, but you have the change of the change of the change of the change of the curve. And some curves and ends up becoming linear after a while when you're going in the other direction. So I rearranged my thing over here for you. So things start at extension. This would help you understand my approach to all these questions and on certain ancient issues. I'm one of these people, and again, you can find out about this at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but I basically believe, though there's some nitpicking to be had, that all ideas are synthetic, right? They're all from the data. All of them. All synthetic. Analytic ideas and analysis, I believe, has been mischaracterized, the standard way people think of it, and it's not separate from synthetic. It's a subset of analysis is what I do when I already have some data. So I've got the data. I don't have to worry about where it came from because I got data, but it always came from here. So the analysis is like, let's pretend we don't care where the data come from. We got data now. Let's think about it. And then, but somehow we can also think without any data. Well, you can't. So analysis is something we do with the synthetic data that we get. So I do believe there are analytic statements, and certainly creating logical tautologies is a way to make something you would call an analytic statement. But really, it has no existence unless it's being used to work with real data, right? And if it can't work with real data, then it's an incoherent fantasy that doesn't even need to be thought about. Right, but if it can, then it's basically a part of this synthetic process of we get actual information. There's only one way to get it, through the experiences, and other people relay their experiences to you, so you can compound it, and you could take photographs and store information so they could be had later and by other people, and all this great stuff that we do, always coming back to the data, and every idea is an abstraction. Our idea of cause and effect, our idea that a line was made of points and then that getting overthrown by it's made of infinitesimal line segments. And when you have things that are supposed tautologies, you'll find they use synthetic terms. So in philosophy, they love to use all bachelors are male. That's absolutely true because it's defined to be true. It's a tautology. Boom. Except even the word "are" has a lot of nitpicking you can do, but certainly male, these are synthetic concepts, and it's always like that. And when you make something that's like, well, this is all about arithmetic, well, what's the relationship between 3 and 4 in math? They might as well be the same number because there's this infinite scalability. It's nothing 3 and 4. What's their relationship purely in math? It's only when applied back to the real world. And how did it get into math? From counting. How did sets get in? From containers. That's where mathematics comes from. And it's not about that. It's more about cognitive science of how people think about maths and categories now. But I think that it shows, it does also have this thesis that shows about how, well, these came from real world objects. Mathematics has taken patterns, certain patterns that seem really useful. So the pattern of containing something, and it becomes a set and a category related so closely to a first order predicate in logic, and it didn't come out of nowhere. It didn't get discovered, and now it doesn't matter where it comes from. It's about containers here, and some of the problems they ran into later on was when they has to do with which part of a physical container metaphor did they do away with. An obvious one is that in math, sets can have an infinite number of numbers, and real containers can't do that. But that seemed to be okay. Sets are fine with that. Sets get really troubly when you talk about them, a set that can have itself in it. But that starts to be tricky. Because a container can't have itself in it, right? It can't contain itself along with other things next to itself that it's containing inside itself. Okay, so, but sets without those limitations are certainly still useful, and even though there became this problem in mathematics and set theory dealing with this, it's not like it was worth stopping. It didn't show that set theory was not useful, so those abstractions are still useful, but their relationship to the source data is also still evident. So I acknowledge that you're attempting to make a clean cut. I can reason as though it's a clean cut. Like I can look at two things and say whether they're one or the other, right? Your distinction is clear enough. Is this an abstraction or is it a physical thing? And it might be both, right? I might be holding it as an abstraction for writing. It's an unsharpened pencil. Might be a metaphor for something that can be useful, but it isn't yet because I can't write with it yet. It could be, some abstraction, but it's definitely also a physical pencil. And primarily it's a physical pencil. Okay, so this we're talking about, it's a physical pencil. Right now I'm thinking about the abstraction of a pencil in general, all the different kinds of potential pencils that have and haven't even yet been built yet, whether what kind of lead, when would it be a pencil versus getting into pen, those kinds of abstractions. Those don't have any particular place except for the places in my head, but still the distinction works. I can remember that, well, in reality, I look at it this other way, but sure, I'm not going to get confused about which things you think are physical at a location in space and which things exist from, sort of the property if they're at a place, maybe they take up space, versus things that exist, what are ideas. But you should remember that I think that's mostly a false distinction. I mean, it's a matter of information theory. You can process this information, discover, you could say, or reduce, dig out other information that is evidently in here. The information is in here, you just have to look closer. So all these levels of abstraction are just looking closer and closer and making wider and wider generalizations. So the part I don't get is like, well, what do you hope to achieve by insisting on that distinction in comparison to the way I say it is, which is it starts at information and it continues to be information. So I don't expect that we're going to have a firm agreement on any of these definitions. The firm definition of life thing, that goes into just the whole extensional idea. Look, we start off with extension. There's a set of things. They look similar. A bunch of red things. What are they? They're all apples. No, some of them are yo-yos. They're just something that causes us to put them in the same group. It could be, hey, I just always randomly grab something, throw it in there everywhere. And when I go in there, we'll see if it's random or maybe it's all stuffed animals. Who knows? We will have this set of things. That's what we start with. So there's living things, right? And the history seems to show that people used to think everything was living. I'm not so sure about that. History also shows that people almost act like they're the only living thing. They kill wantonly animals, mostly. Not wantonly, but I mean, there's evidence that they're treating themselves, that what do they really, what would it even mean if they do think other things are alive, because they are only having their own experience. So you see that behavior in life. So whatever the history of it is, we see we're alive, we think other humans are alive, the mammals, the animals, all these things that we found before we get to the germ world. Now, do I have to have my firm definition to discuss life? No, there's an extension of things. That's the extensional set of things. And as it happens, you and I agree on what counts as being alive 99.9%. Right? Let's just say about all the animals. That's the extensional, quote unquote, definition. Now, it doesn't have any way of telling us a technical definition of what to put in there, right? We don't need to rush and just choose one. Choose, it has DNA. Well, if we chose so arbitrary as that, we already would have had a definition. It consumes and excretes and has this behavior or that. And it's not so simple. The fact is we have this extension, and then philosophy is where we try to characterize and come up with the definitions for it. We're trying to discover a definition of life. And I showed you the Stanford Encyclopedia page. It told you my only definition is kind of like this treatise. I have the same view as that page has, which there's a lot of different ways of describing a technical definition of life. They all come from particular domains of biology or philosophy that don't necessarily have an axe to grind, but they're coming from a certain perspective, and they're all an attempt. I mean, defining what a human is intentionally, even, because you could say, well, it has this genes, sure, but for a lot of times, it's like it's the tool-using animal. Oops, lots of animals, even most might use tools in various ways. It's the animal that wrote the Webster's Dictionary, but that was just one guy. So, well, no, I guess there's a whole company that does it now. So we're searching for these definitions of life, and there's a lot of good definitions. And which one am I leading on? It's not the DNA thing. If I was leaning in one direction, as I told you, it would be in the Schopenhauer direction of systems that sustainably violate the laws of thermodynamics, right? So not only are they pumping energy in the unnatural way, or the way that takes energy to do, but they keep marshaling more energy specifically in a way to keep maintaining that. And that system, as long as they do that, as long as they maintain those entropy pumps, it's a living system. That's the direction I'm going for my technical guess as to where the technical definition of recognizing life on a physical level with a perfectly good technical intentional definition, that is the direction that I'd go. On the other hand, these other concepts are very interesting. The fact that we have been able to see the behavior of a thing, see the behavior of something just flicking around in a drop of water, and realize that's not just floating around, that's swimming. How could you do it? Well, there's 5 of them, and if you see a little movie, you can easily see the way they're going. Now, you could be fooled by a little piece of feather that's flowing around in there, bouncing on the wind for a while. But if you look for a long time and are really careful, you can tell that, oh no, that is a little bit of fluff in the water, and that is a little bug from the behavior. So that's pretty interesting that we managed to discover living systems from that, confirm they all are entropy pumping systems, and that they're all physically related through DNA. So I don't start from definitions. I think people are fooling themselves when they say that. I start from the data and create definitions off of the data. That's how scientific analysis works. That's how a good philosophy works, in my view. So obviously there must be a lot of bad philosophy, because not everybody does that. Yeah, well, my view is that you start from the data. You start from the data. You always return to the data. The data always remains first. When you rerun your analysis because you got a better technique, you rerun it from the data. You see a pattern and you group things together, and maybe the pattern was apophenic and those things don't really go together. Well, by seeing the pattern and putting them all in there, you can go later to that set and double check and see, are these things really related? What relates them? Oh, they've all got DNA. That's a pretty good evidence that my pattern recognition caught something real. I see the physical similarity, right? You know, and that works with any group. You put things in the group and you're like, I don't really see what relates these all together. I mean, for example, use a subjective example because this is about how we're putting things in groups from our pattern recognition built-in machinery. And then we're going to double check and see if it made any sense. Take all your pet peeves. Oh, I hate when people hit the, clack their fork on their teeth, or I hate when people have a button undone, or, just little things, little pet peeves. Take them all, put them in a set. That's the extension of your pet peeves. Then go try to create an intentional. What do these things have in common? What is it about these things, that bug me? And you can find things. Some people might find, oh, it's when I associate that particular thing that's pet peeve with arrogance or thoughtlessness, or it reminds me of my own flaws, or, or maybe not. It's like, I don't know why those things, I just don't like my cottage cheese pressed up against the salad or whatever. And that's extensional analysis. You keep track of what's in the group. You can have multiple candidates, right? Like I was saying, you can have dogs, and one candidate for dogs has wolves and coyotes and foxes in it. And another one is like, no, it just has the domesticated dogs, right? And you could say the other group is called canines. And we'd have candidates for that, and then candidate descriptions of how we would technically decide if something goes in that group. And if I was going to technically decide on life, I'd go in this entropic thing, that we have the laws of thermodynamics, and then we have these certain systems special in that they specifically collect and spend energy to overcome the laws of thermodynamics and be sustainable on purpose. And then you see all the secondary behaviors of that. Goal behaviors to get food and to survive, pain reaction behaviors, flight, fight. So extension is first, and I can understand your definition, but no, I'm not going to, we're not going to agree. If it's like literally, oh, you have to agree with me that this is an absolutely sharp, distinct, well, okay, I don't believe anything is an absolutely sharp distinction. I believe that distinction between the place and abstraction type of existence, it's workable. It's not particularly good. It's not even particularly sharp in my view. It's workable, and it's related to some classical philosophical approach. The good old dualism, mind and body dualism, basically. It's a physicalist version of that, maybe. I'm not exactly sure what its subcategory of that would be, but I abandoned that long time ago. I don't believe in that kind of dualism. I believe that there's the data, and from this data we have an idea of space and place that applies to all things, I think. It doesn't seem to, but I think it doesn't seem to at first, but on close inspection, I think, I'm a materialist means that that concept of space we abstracted, it applies to a lot of things, and then including abstractions. And the idea of an abstraction is an abstraction, right? It's like we got all of these principles and stuff, and we have an idea above them that says, what do all those have in common? Oh, they're abstractions. So to me, putting them side by side is, okay, they're both side by side because they're both derived from this, but also is the color red, and also is, right? I mean, if if you had a vision, just a memory of redness, and you were so sure, it's so vivid that it's from something, I just can't remember the rest of the memory. You know, what would be the existence of that color without a concept of space, and your belief that ultimately it was a real memory, and when you remembered the whole thing, you'd remember where you were or what object it was that was red, right? And the chains of reasoning from this partial memory that doesn't include all the space and time of something, just a color, the steps you take to get back to what the data was or your memory of what the data was, that's basically how I generally see the relationship between abstractions and data. You go this way to make the abstractions, and you go this way to try to find back. And when you find an abstraction that leads perfectly back to the extension, that seems to be the set of things that all belong in the same category for purposes of reasoning, then you have a really good apt abstraction. But still not the only one, still never going to be fundamental. It's a data reduction thing, and it's fundamental to a model of the real world, right? Like a model of the real world, let's say a video game where you have video game physics. That model incorporates these concepts to create something that feels like, we could say, hey, there's physics in this game, and you're jumping, and you can even have a lot of that sensation, secondhand by watching even a platform jumper, the guy jumping. And so the laws of physics, the abstraction, rules of physics in that game are fundamental. The whole game is wrapped around them. But those principles came from a reduction of the real world. And when we are doing philosophy and not making a video game, and we're using those rules to say, look, here's how everything goes back together, and you get back to this data. Wow, everything actually starts at my principle. No, your principle actually is still a reduction, is reduced. Data reduction from the data into the principle. So if you did a good job in this direction, it for sure guaranteed should lead back to the real world, because you did a good job in this direction. You can't just have an idea I discovered, now I don't care about the real world, and look, it goes back to the real world. It's only going to make its way back to predicting and working in the real world if the deductive process from the data went well. Then you'll be able to use an inductive process from your principle back to the world, because really you're just tracing the deductive process backwards. All right, I might have misused inductive and deductive there. I guess I'd have to think about it. Yeah, I mean, basically, deductive is getting data inside, and inductive, you go outside the set. But I think it applies in that case, because here's the set of data. So deductive is ding, 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 ding. Then you have a little tiny idea, and to get outside of it, you have to go beyond the data. The principle is like its own data. And you say, well, if this principle is true, boom, the next step means, right? And so that's the inductive process. And as you do that, your one statement, which is a really trying to be very general, a universal statement, it keeps going N1 and 2, 3, and as it goes further in its deduction, where's it going? It's going in this direction, back towards the data, trying to hook up with the data, because if it can't, then it's worthless. So it's always in this one direction, and I think you could probably, I think you're just kind of stubborn of not being able to see how that affects my positions, and that if you have something to say based on this, something further to say based on this place and abstraction existence, then say it, because we're going to see where that goes. And part of judging your definitions is, where does it go, right? That's how we judge if our definitions are any good, is we go use them. So if you need me to agree with your definition before you go do that, that's a problem. I understand your definition. If you want me to understand it even better, fine, but be careful. Don't be wanting me to have more sympathy with your definition. It's not necessary that I have any more sympathy for your definition than I currently have. I have enough sympathy to picture it honestly in a way, like if I had to pretend to be HYTHLODAY, since this is the HYTHLODAY definition, and somebody was asking me, okay, how many kinds of existence are there? Well, there's two basic categories in the HYTHLODAYan system. You know, which category is this in? It's in the has a at a place principle. Where is the concept of I think therefore I am go? Well, that would be in the abstract, right? Am I getting that right? So if you want to clarify that more, fine, but don't be like in Mr. Convincing mode needs to have an agreement, an acknowledgement of the sort where I'm validating um, that's a absolutely sharp tautology. No, I understand that you mean it as to be some sort of sharp tautology, and I would say it's pretty sharp. It's scissors sharp. Not really quite razor sharp, but it's, you know, it's cutting implement sharp. And you know, where are you going to go with it? I can follow where you're going to go with that. Can you follow? Do you understand why my definition, the order of my definitions, means that I can't see an abstraction as a fundamental distinction? Like, to me, you've got the idea of an abstraction, and you've got the idea of space, and there's siblings, and sure, you could say, hey, this and that, but you're saying everything falls in one of those? Well, abstractions, I mean, that's one thing we'll find out. Is there no third category then? Are there not other siblings? Well, abstraction is kind of a wild card, right? Anything that doesn't fit in a place, we just call it, oh, it's an abstraction. We could call it an idea, though. You know, but my position is pretty weak towards letting you call anything an abstraction, because as I said, the color green is an abstraction, and it's primary data at the same time. So the primary data actually starts as a kind of abstraction, and it gets more abstract from there, where we don't even worry about the color of the law of conservation. It doesn't have a color, but you know, should space be considered more fundamental than color? No, color is more direct. Space is pretty direct too, except for we've got this thing where we really can pretty easily tell that our two-dimensional eyes are adding together and making that 3D. So we know there's an allusion to the 3D right away before we even realize there's an allusion to the color, with the fact that the color's in the brain and outside is a wavelength. And so all the data in here is an abstraction, and space is pretty fundamental because it applies to so many, you know, already to, you know, our five most trusted senses, and you know, and a kind of reverse analysis of things that don't even seem spatial, like the idea of a unicorn. It doesn't exist in space. There are no unicorns, but it's in my head, so it's located right in there. I don't know if you'll get it or not, but I think you need to follow your advice about there's two sets of definitions here, and you need to understand mine better. I think I'm quicker following your proposed definition than you are mine. And also, you haven't seen that, no, actually, there's structural differences between your and mine where it's not going to turn out that semantically we're believing the same thing. Okay, you believe in this some sort of a more pure analytic, non-physical reality that doesn't have to check the data with the data. I zero believe that. 0% of chance that there's some concept that you could have and know is right without checking the data, or any concept you could have that's just like universally right. And that's simple. That's simple relativism. It should not be a surprise that there's people in the philosophical discussion with that position. It's a very common position. And you know, if you don't understand it, maybe the problem is not that I don't validate your definition or have a firm agreement with the character of your definition. Maybe the issue is just you need to understand my definition so you can understand the differences already, and then go ahead and say why your definition leads to a better analysis of the situation. That's what I would think was the goal. But also, we got to this point where there's a lot of loose threads, so it's probably time to start over with something more focused. But if you don't want to, that's fine. But don't complain that I have a bunch of subjects in my video replying to your video that's a bunch of subjects, right? So don't have it both ways. Um, if you want to bring focus, choose the one thing you think you need to focus on. Like if you really think, no, you should acknowledge the perfect tautology of physical versus abstract, you could go ahead and try to do that, and I'll listen. I'm giving you a prediction. I don't think that's going to happen. That you could make, something to focus on that. But in this general thing, as a general conversation, I think what's going on is you don't really get my definitions. You don't really get the structure of my definitional system. It goes all the way through the whole philosophy, from start to physics to emotion, being a living creature, and there's an order to it, specifically trying to unwrap the circularity of saying, I've got some axioms that they just prove themselves, and I prove the world from it. So the world comes from the axioms when all those axioms came from the data in the world. People are backwards. So, and I'm not going to call your ideas in general flat earth stuff, but you're talking about me being like a homeless hippie in the street with my ideas that trees are alive. Oh, see what I did there? And I'm like, dude, you have a conspiracy theory about peer review data. I might go look for some of those, but I don't. It's not that hard to find them. It's obvious. Like, you read the stuff on the Which Way articles, and you don't believe it, and you don't go hunt down scientific journals on it. Find out if your local library has some scientific journals. They wouldn't have to be very new. So I might go look for that, but you're here saying that all this peer reviewing, yeah, things can go wrong. There could even be a journal that's corrupt and people are getting paid bribes and the peer review process has been corrupted. But they have a peer review process, and as compared to a real peer review process that you could find the corruption, and it is policed, and it doesn't just go on for 100 years that people say we've done this experiment and now we're doing the Which Way and erasure versions, and it's all just made up. But you want to call my ideas phantasmagorical? I don't even mind. I think phantasmagorical is a good name for certain kind of informational ideas that are important. But I think you should realize that where I am on consciousness is, I'm not very different from the way the whole trend has been going, that the animals are conscious, that they actually do feel pain. It doesn't just look like pain. It's not anthropomorphism to say that when you step on a mouse's tail, it does hurt. The mouse is feeling pain. We all know that now and feel it was proved. And but I'm not that old. I remember people, it's not that hard to find people that would argue that bullshit. Okay, so I'm fine where I'm in consciousness compared to thinking that the scientific establishment is so corrupt that all of these different peer-reviewed journals are just been lying. Not just one of them that has a bias or is run by somebody that has an axe to grind or a particular scientific theory, or the journal is about pushing that theory. No, all of the theories, something that now students are doing, as I should link to you, a student experiment for the erasure using polarization. And you're saying all of those guys, it's just a big conspiracy. Yeah. So, I wouldn't throw stones, personally, if I was you, about what's ludicrously unbelievable and worth your time, is what I mean. So, yeah, those are the reasons that it's also difficult to talk to you, and also I enjoy it. I enjoy the challenge. Sometimes I don't like the distraction. I feel like you point your finger to say, you should do this and that, and it's something you're not doing. Like, you should understand the other definition, and then you say, but we have to have firm agreement. It's like, well, which is it? You say you were Britannic and take every step. Well, I believe I do not avoid an answer. You just don't like the answers I give. That's what happens. You ask me a question, I give you the answer, whereas you actually have avoided questions, if anything, I would say. But I'm not making a big deal of it. It's just that, again, you started your video with these kinds of issues that are evidently still important. And it goes both ways. I also feel it's worthwhile. I like being able to have conversations with you, but there's a big difficult part. On the other hand, I sorted out a lot of the difficult part years ago and understood, okay, here's how where you're coming from, here's sort of how you think, here's things that set you off. I'm not going to try to push your buttons on purpose, and I'm not trying to hold back information in order to, you know, to not push your buttons though either, right? And that's the agreement. Even when we both thought we were friends, I mean, it was basically on that kind of basis of like, yeah, we're friends in this discussion thing. There's no point to be friends in this discussion thing and subvert it by not saying what we think, right? So, be that as it may, the summary is I have a directional way I analyze the world and all abstractions. Okay, and I've laid that out to you. You can see where space and abstraction in general fit in that structure. And you can see that the structure is of them being a perfect dichotomy. No, they're two siblings. I don't know if they cover the whole world of existence, except for by the cheap way of anything that doesn't have a place. We could just call it an abstraction. Right? The color red doesn't have a place, so I get to call it abstraction, but it's also primary data. So, and you never see red without it being in a space. So we could sort out those subjects, but not by insisting on having a firm agreement on the definitions. And you are the one of the two of us that both have pointed out that we have different extensions, and I pointed out different definitions for things that we have to keep in mind, because philosophy, we're comparing the value of those definitions. So we're going to have to be able to keep them both in mind. We can't just do one definition its own. It's in comparison to alternate definitions. Right? So, and then I add on top of that each definition is actually sets of definitions, because there's the extension and the intension, and then there's actually, I have some openness of like, well, what goes in the extension of living things? Well, there's a lot of things that certainly go in there, and then we have some ones, I wonder, a virus? What about a virus that wasn't viable but could be made viable by a human, intentionally, or could be made viable if it lucks out, and runs into just the right chemical? Would that be, so even the extension has some openness, fuzziness of like, well, what would you want to put in there? And again, that's the philosophical process, thinking about, well, what should go, what seems from pattern similarity reasons to go in there. Because I know it when I see it, it's basically saying, well, I put a photograph of this and a transparency of this, and I put them over each other, and oh, look, they're similar. I'll put them in the similar bucket. Find out what really makes them similar, or even if they really are similar later. So with life, with abstractions, if we're going to talk more about abstraction, for example, I'll get to the point of like, give me examples of abstraction. Is red an abstraction? Is it the word, the idea? Can an example be an abstraction? We'd be doing things like that. We'd be setting up what is the extension of things, and in this case, they're ideas, right? The extension of abstractions obviously is going to be abstractions. So there'll be ideas, in which ones? And then to intentionally describe abstraction, I'm going to say, hey, you have to have a definition that picks out those things that you say are abstractions. And that's the whole process in the test. And I also will have multiple candidates for both the extension of what counts as abstract and the definitions that pick those things out. The intentional definitions are like little algorithms that can pick things out and put them in that thing. And we're not going to say, hey, we like intentional definitions so much, we're just going to choose one. It's DNA. No. That's not going to be the process. It can't be the process, because that's getting things backward, where the intentional definition is a part of the data reduction. We go to the data and try to find out a definition that then fits what it's supposed to be. And when we get a really good fit, some of those things like viruses will go, turns out we got a really good definition. It works so solid. We're going to go ahead and rely on it. Turns out viruses are alive or aren't, right? And those distinctions will get embedded in, in adjectives, right? Dormant life, we'll call that, right? Viable, not exactly at the moment life, we'll use, and this is the process by which we dig down and get those better things. And the intentional definition is inherently at the bottom of the waterfall, right? So we can't start by having to have a certain intentional definition. But I understand people try to do that, and I can think that way. I just have to walk backwards.